Good morning and welcome to this Mills and Reeve Health and Care Conversation webinar on primary care redevelopment and the role of the ICB. My name's Jennifer Lewis. I'm a real estate lawyer here at Mills and Reeve, specialising in GP premises. I'm very pleased to be joined today by Ian Hume and Jonathan Webb. Ian is a practicing Macmillan GP with 30 years clinical experience and is here today with his unprecedented wealth of knowledge of premises policy and initiatives in his role as Deputy Premises Lead at the BMA. And Jonathan is a Senior Development Manager at Assura. Jonathan's delivered 20 plus medical centre schemes with 5 projects currently under construction, and this includes the UK's first dementia-friendly medical centre. We're each going to speak for about 10 minutes today, and then there'll be time for questions hopefully at the end, and you can put these in the Q&A as we go through. So I will hand you over now to Ian.
Good morning. So in my presentation today, I plan to give you some of the policy context and the evidence base leading up to the General Practice Policy Review, which concluded in 2019. This is actually worth a reread as it sets the theme for the future direction under an ICB. The recommendations for this will support the development of the ICS and underpin the importance of a strategic estate plan. So in 2018, the BMA published a survey on GP premises. This presented a stark picture. Only 50% of practices felt that their premises met their present needs. When considering the future, a staggering 80% felt that their buildings would be inadequate to meet the developing needs. And this was before additional roles had really started to impact. The survey also highlighted the age of much of the primary care estate, showing a lack of investment. And I think 29% of the estate was built before 1965. And the statistics are showing that 10% actually predate the NHS itself. The practices that do get agreement often find the development process is tortuous, with potential and significant delays. This has been evident in the rollout of the ETTF and practices suddenly finding that they're having to sign up to additional grant agreements and what seems to them like random agreements. The GP Partnership Review also identified increasing reluctance on partners to take on the risks. So this paints an urgent picture of a need for investment and de-risking from ownership and occupancy. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the NHS long-term plan sets out the ambition for primary community care and plays an increasingly integrated role in promoting health promotion, well-being, and helping patients manage long-term conditions, particularly associated with an ageing population. NHS England and the BMA agreed a 5-year framework for the GP contract, giving security of funding and promoting the development of the primary care networks, groups of GPs working collaboratively together, but with support of other services and agencies to support community care, what I call the wraparound services. Funding for this is coming through from the network DES, which has enabled expansion of the additional workforce roles to support GPs directly. This is a little bit slow at the moment, but these are directly employed by the PCN working in practices, and they will need accommodation under GMS. There's also going to be an increasing need for community staff seeing patients in surgeries, so the thrust of treatment closer to home presents challenges with the rules for abatement, which have hindered this approach in the past. So we need to address some of these. We need clarity. It's not lost on me that 30 years ago, when I started in practice, I moved into a health centre with a full complement of practice staff and community support, such as health visitors, social workers, physiotherapists, dietitians. These services were gradually moved out as successive organisations moved the goalposts and the rules about abatement and occupation became more complex. The ICS underpins both clinical and estate strategy, will have the authority to set their own agenda, and it's vital that GPs are involved and have input into this. Also, government policies have been to expand digital technology with communication with patients. So practices have responded phenomenally to a changing working pattern almost overnight with the pandemic, and general practice has seen a 20% increase in workload since the beginning of the pandemic. So some of today's audience will be aware of some of the tensions we're seeing between virtual consultations and face-to-face, but I guess that's probably a topic for another conversation. So next one, please. It's important to look at the conclusions of the General Practice Premises Policy Review. One significant risk for GPs is signing up to long leases and then feeling trapped with a genuine fear of being the last man standing. The impact of this has been significant in some areas, deterring recruitment. So one of the recommendations from the NHS England should be looking at its strategic estate and considering how leases could be assigned to other NHS bodies if necessary, or other entities. This could be very effective in addressing some of the last man standing situations. The flexibility in the past, where PCTs could actually own and manage property, could be repeated under the ICS, which is likely to be case specific, for example, addressing specific needs in a strategically important part of the estate. So the BMA is also pushing for a plural approach. So the recommendation is that GPs property ownership should still continue where it makes sense. So we need options effectively. NHS England also want to develop good practice guidance to ensure GP partners understand their responsibilities and liabilities. It's also about funding agreements to make sure that good governance is in place. This will lead to improved professionalism and understanding of GP managing their own asset. It would set out clear expectations for owners and occupiers around maintenance and standards. NHS England want to pilot network level premises reimbursement arrangements, allowing greater flexibility and autonomy for PCNs, and pilot models of arrangements with multi-user building where the NHS could bear some of the costs directly, reducing the level of bureaucracy and associated with multi-agency use. A lack of clear understanding and complexity in this and the premises cost directions has also impeded some of these developments. One recommendation not taken forward was central ownership of the estate or state-backed loans, as we saw in Scotland. The next slide, please. So the Health and Care Bill will make ICBs statutory bodies from April 2022. The system will be made up of NHS, local authorities and third sector. There'll be a smaller integrated care board looking at the core services, which will be have delegated authority for primary care in its widest remit and also premises. So the role of the ICB will be absolutely vital. There's also going to be supported by the Integrated Care Partnership, which has a much wider remit. It's clear that the advent of integrated care systems presents an opportunity for both lessons to be learned from the past, but also redefine the direction of travel for the primary care estate. And returning to the position we had with primary care trusts, as I said, ICBs may be able to take on some of the property liabilities. The next, please. SPPs have been required to develop their own premises strategy for some time, and this includes taking into account the needs of the PCNs. Some of these are slightly delayed, and there'll be a renewed focus on developing strategic plans. In the background, we've been working, work has progressed to develop this estate planning and the support needed strategically. The NALEV report identified that there's no reliable data, and without good data, it's difficult to make credible bids for money from Treasury. So that led to development of strategic planning and also some surveys such as the 3-facet survey to look at the condition of the buildings. We're at an early stage of understanding the data, but it'll become more and more important as we move forward, and we'll be integrated with things such as the shape tool. There's also going to be a significant amount of estate which might struggle to be used to deliver some of the ambitions of the long-term plan. So we need good buildings in good order. Some of those buildings which are substandard may well need to be looking at relocation, and the issues sometimes are that the cheap buildings, the old buildings are cheap and cheerful, and there may well need to be some incentives for people to move into sort of larger and multi-purpose buildings, particularly if there's a perception that the costs will increase on that. The government's also pledged 1.8 billion to upgrade the current NHS estate. This includes building hospitals. One of our concerns is the spending review is that political pressure to be seen to be building hospitals will take precedent over the ambitions of supporting the community in long-term plan. So we still need investment in primary care. The next, please. So looking at COVID, that's actually, sorry, that's I've just done that one. So next one there, look at COVID, please. So we've seen significant changes in consultation with a move to virtual consultations almost overnight, but still with the ability of clinicians to bring people into a face-to-face consultation if they need to. It's a fallacy to think that switching to digital technology will reduce our space requirement. Health building notes will look at this requirement. We've seen a significant change in patient behaviour due to the pandemic, with an initial reluctance to come into the surgery. But now the debate about the balance between face-to-face and virtual consultations is well live. The bottom line is that buildings must plan for social distancing, good infection control, and dictate for fewer people coming into the surgeries. The pandemic, I think, has also exposed our lack of emergency preparedness in the estate. So looking forward, we need to ensure that buildings are suitable for infection control and have the ability for good patient flows and good ventilation. So next, please. So the premises for review has moved to the implementation stage. The primary care reformation programme is taking the work forward, particularly about de-risking ownership for GPs. Essentially, if a building is strategically important and of good order, then the NHS needs to be able to commit to it. When we're seeing large buildings with values of between 2 and 5 million or even more, then there needs to be a long-term commitment from the NHS. This can't always be taken on as a burden from GP partners. It's been recognised that the reformation programme is drawing up proposals. There is some urgency in this as we move to the new landscape of the ICS, and we expect to see some of these papers published shortly. So next, please. Other important documents to consider is the health building notes, which is effectively a handbook of what to build. We're still working on the premises cost directions and trying to get those over the line. But also, I think, consider the green agenda. The NHS has already got an ambitious target. Any new development will need to take into consideration the green impact. So next, please. Oh, so in conclusion, there's been significant developments and support from the policy. We've now got great opportunities to resolve some of the significant barriers that we've seen in the past. We're expecting in the next few months some of these documents to be published, which should set the scene for implementation of a more strategic approach to premises development.
Thanks for that, Ian. I'm going to talk now. As I've mentioned before, I'm Jennifer Lewis. I'm a Principal Associate here at Mills and Reeve in the real estate team. I've been advising GPs on their premises issues for about 15 years. Over the next 10 minutes, I'm just going to briefly look at the current issues with GP premises and then move on to the potential role of the ICBs when they come into existence next April. If I could have the next slide, please. So the current issues are set out here on this slide, and we're all familiar with them, and there was a lot of really useful work. Ian mentioned some of it done around 2018-19 with the BMA and NHS England in looking at the issues and the root causes of those issues. Essentially, the major issue is the quality of the primary care estate, which is recognised by most as not being fit for the future. Essentially, although primary care itself is modernising, the estate is not keeping up. And that's even more so now. We've got greater requirements around the NHS long-term plan, the aims of the primary care networks, social distancing, the requirements to have some digital provision and sustainability goals. In both the investigations into the partnership issues and the premises, the issue of last partner standing, which Ian's already mentioned, was highlighted as one of the major significant factors. And in addition to that, the premises ownership model is often incompatible with the desires of the primary care networks. It's really difficult to appraise which premises are central to the provision of healthcare in your area when there's vested interests that the individual GPs have, whether it's an investment or a liability. The premises cost directions, as we know, they're also outdated, inflexible, particularly where we've got multi-use buildings. I quite often have people coming to me saying, oh, we want to provide this additional service and we have to do a bit of a fudge around the reimbursement, but ultimately it's individual GPs that are then left bearing the risk should it fail, and it's difficult then to take those chances. And the premises cost directions are an issue not just for the regular reimbursement, but also for capital funding. One of the major issues is that where the directions do permit investment, it ties to the individual partners in the partnership, not the premises. And again, this creates a burden. People were concerned about whether they can then move on or whether there will be any clawback, when in fact the premises are still being used for the invested purpose. Next slide, please. So how will the ICBs help? The big news here, I suppose, is that they can both hold and invest in property, which, as we know, the CCGs wouldn't be able to do. So this means they could be useful either as owners of choice for new developments or owners of last resort to remove that risk that we've discussed of becoming a last partner standing. Can I have the next slide, please? So I'm going to look at both of those in more detail. First, as owners of choice for new developments. And I think the first thing to say here is I don't think, or I may be proved wrong, but I don't think that they'll be the lead on those developments. I don't think the ICBs are going to have the resources in terms of the people or the ability because of the requirement for the upfront capital expenditure. So I'd expect them more likely to work with the healthcare developer or maybe the local authority, take a lease, fit it out, and then have subleases to the GP tenants and other providers. And I think some of you might be aware that NHSBS are doing some of that already. The benefit of this for GPs and the other providers is the flexibility in the lease provisions. And again, this is something we've already seen where NHSBS have sat between the healthcare developer and the providers. And of course, it's totally understandable that healthcare developers, they need to have that security in their lease because of the upfront capital expenditure they've made, and they need the return on that investment. And now with it, well, when the ICBs come in, they can then get that security from the ICB. And then the ICB, with the control over commissioning, will be able to be more flexible with the subtenants that it has in. Should there be a risk of the void space for a period, it'll be the ICB that bears that rather than the individual GP partners. And that seems right to me because obviously they've got the ability to control commissioning and what other services are provided from that building. There's also greater security in this for the healthcare investor, as they're no longer relying on the GP partnership model and ensuring that the GP contract is maintained in the same way. And the benefit for the ICB is that they're then in control of strategically important premises rather than these being held and controlled by individuals. I'd note just a note for anyone that's going to be involved in an ICB is there's a risk here. Obviously, the PCTs back in the day quite regularly let GPs in without any documentation, any documented tenancies, and some of us are still trying to unpick the problems that came out of that today. So I would just highlight that as a risk. But this structure does take away that personal element that I mentioned before of decision making around utilisation of buildings. And it's easier then for the ICB and also for the primary care networks to manage their premises strategy, as there's no personal wealth or liability issues involved. However, it should be noted, of course, you can't force the GPs to dispose of the premises if they want to carry on holding them. And so it's likely the current model, where there are many different forms of ownership of GP surgeries, is likely to continue for some time. The ICB can then also be a beneficiary of grants under the premises cost directions, meaning it doesn't matter whether it ties to the grantee or whether it ties, because obviously the ICB will be there even if the individual GPs move on. And this will help keep buildings up to date and comply with requirements such as energy efficiency and air quality standards. I mentioned that NHSPS are already doing this kind of model in a number of places. I expect they'll probably continue to do that, which is fine. I think there are also a number of pros in using the ICB model. NHSPS, as we all know, is a large, potentially under-resourced organisation, and it can be difficult to get movement quickly. And when they do, it's quite often an inflexible one-size-fits-all solution, which may not meet your needs. The ICS, on the other hand, are likely to consist of various local health bodies who will be more connected into the requirements of the local health economy. And the ICB, being the commissioner, not just the property owner, will have some control as well. And I often find when negotiating with NHSPS for GPs to take their subleases, we then have to get a confirmation from the CCG for the approval. And then if we're putting other services in as well, we have to get the approval for that. And still, ultimately, it is the GPs who are bearing the risk. And it can become very complicated with the various bodies involved, unnecessarily so. I also hope that the involvement of local authorities in the ICB will see an increase in multi-use buildings, and I think Ian mentioned this as well. Presumably this is part of the thinking behind the ICS, and it's not just in terms of social care, but I'm also thinking about libraries, leisure centres. This is sort of thing we have seen in some areas, but it can be extremely difficult to get the public bodies to all work together in that way, and hopefully the creation of the ICS will get over that. And I can see that kind of institution becoming an anchor institution for regeneration in an area. Interestingly, I attended recently a seminar on the use of Section 106 monies in health centres and building new health centres, and it's highly contentious actually. The two QCs presenting from the same chambers had a disagreement and couldn't agree on whether or not it was possible. But whether it is possible or not, it has happened. And they said arguably that's because the amounts involved were so small that the house builders would rather pay than actually go through the trouble of resisting paying. And I wonder whether the ICB will have more ability to sort of go into bat on that issue, and whether that might result in more 106 monies going towards the building of health centres, which would also be helpful. Next slide, please. So this is moving on to look at the other potential for the ICB, which is as owner of last resort. So this should hopefully give GPs more confidence in signing up to leases, because if they were concerned about becoming the last partner standing, then or just whether they wanted to move on or whether they just felt the liability was too large, then potentially the ICB could step in and take over the lease. This should also give GPs confidence in joining partnerships where the partnership requires them to sign up to an existing lease, which of course they should. And this preserves the long-term future of the practice, and ironically actually then takes away the last partner standing issue, because you're improving the succession of the practice and the long-term sustainability of the practice as well. It'd be interesting to see how this evolves, whether the ICB will take a guarantee or whether it will simply be flexibility in the lease provisions. And in addition to that, I'd also expect that the ICB may take up subleases of any void spaces which arise over time. At the moment, it's likely in those situations the CCG will fill that space with an additional service, but ultimately it's the GPs that still bear the risk of that, and hopefully that will remove that concern for GPs. Next slide, please. So many of you may have signed up to this seminar thinking, well, we've already got a development in the pipeline being planned, and that's why you've come along today. So how does this affect you in your current development? Well, it depends how far along you are. You may want to revisit some of the lease drafting and just have a look at it with these thoughts in mind, and think about whether there's any changes, in particular around your ability to assign, sublet, use the property. If you have partners who are risk averse, or you're struggling to get them to sign up to something, you may want to take a wait and see approach. But I suppose some premises issues are more urgent than others. And at the end of the day, we've always held property in a number of different ways, and I suspect that will continue for some time. And it's also difficult as well to say how long it will take ICBs to get up and running. So if you've got an urgent premises issue, you may just need to get on with it anyway. And those with a vision for integrated care or a multi-use building, again, the opportunities may widen with the advent of the ICB. But again, these things can take a while, and so you probably still want to be getting those plans together and people on board with that idea now. If you're looking at premises as part of your primary care network strategy, estate strategy, it's vital to think about the ownership, how those properties are owned, because you can't do things with some of them without a significant amount of time in trying to resolve issues that may be there. And just by way of a reminder, GPs can still do their own developments as well. That's happened. That's always happened in the past. There are risks, of course, involved with that, but there are rewards as well, and many GPs are happy to take those. Next slide, please. And just lastly, really, just thinking about your current premises, and should you be doing anything with those with the advent of the ICBs? Well, I would always say, if you've got a lease, just have a look at it every now and then, just check what the drafting says. Have a think about whether it can do some of these things that you might want be thinking about with your primary care network. And again, if you've got freehold premises, have a think about your repair responsibilities, make sure that the property is maintained in the way that it should be, and consider its flexibility of use around any strategic issues with the primary care network coming up. So in conclusion, I would say the changes may take a while to come in, but hopefully they will go some way to resolving some of these issues. And I think that's a really positive thought to finish on. With that, I will hand over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Jen. Hi, everyone. My name's John Webb from Assura. I'm a senior development manager here. And I'm going to be talking to you about a bit about the challenges, themes and risk about 3PD premises development. So on to the next slide, please, if that's okay. There's lots of numbers you'll see on this page, and a little bit about Assura is the number 3 is probably the most important. We do 3 things. We develop new build GP premises, we buy existing ones, and we manage them. And we do all of that in-house. I think, as Jen's mentioned, and also Ian has, our model is all about being a landlord to GP tenants. So GPs are our tenants, and we've got about 600 or over 600 NHS buildings across the UK, primarily GP practices. And there's about 6 million patients registered at those to our GP customers. In terms of what we've also got, we've got 13 schemes under construction nationwide, and that's probably been the same for the last couple of years. And I'll come on to some of those changes in a second. But also, as Ian and Jen have both mentioned too, for us, we're very much alive to the green agenda and to looking at social impact and sustainability credentials and developments too. So we've set ourselves a target of hitting net zero carbon developments exclusively by 2026, which is, I think, 4 years ahead of the NHS doing the same, as we talk about the 2020s as the decade of action. But we're not just a kind of a landlord and private investor. We're a listed company, but we're also set up a charity last year, the Assura Community Foundation. And I'm pleased to say that I think as of next month, we're scheduled to give away we're hitting the £1 million mark in terms of grants given to charities and organisations that are within a 15-mile radius of our practice. So on to the next slide, please. We've got some numbers on the previous page, but this page is all about kind of what we do in a nutshell. So we take old existing GP practices and other community uses. So this is a scheme in Bewdley, for example, and we move them into new build premises. The scheme's actually about 5 years old now, and I'd echo what Jen says about the inclusion here of a library that you might have noted, that definitely adds complication to the whole system, and that's definitely something that's not getting easier. So over there to the next slide, please. Here are some of the kind of key market trends at Assura that we're noticing in the sector. Now, I'm not going to go into the top one in any form of detail because the shift from face-to-face to kind of a digital-first approach for many is well documented. We know quite interestingly that in 2020, August 2020, I think the face-to-face number of consultations was 58% and is continuing to rise and is here to stay. But what we have seen as a company is actually the issues of the last 18 months or so really accelerating that demand for outdated, not fit for purpose medical centres needing investment. And that demand has been there for a long time previously. Ian's mentioned about the BMA 2018 survey that came out that talked already about the amount of the state that's not fit for purpose for the future. So that's not a surprise, but we think that the kind of acceleration of that demand, plus also crucially, the demand not only from clinicians, but also from patients as we look at backlogs, misdiagnosis and issues within the system is giving us a bit of a perfect storm at the moment. So when you lay that in and you add that into potential changes or potential inertia, should we say, of CCGs changing to ICSs, for us, there's it's some quite interesting times as we look ahead to 2022. But underpinning all of that, of course, is what we're experiencing from our point of view outside of the kind of NHS sector and from a property and construction perspective. So build cost inflation is racing at the moment. We have issues with material supplies. We have delays created by that. We have price increases created by that. We have tenant failure as an issue, but also contractor insolvency, delays with planning and increased land prices. So, you know, I'm a glass half full kind of person. We'll get over all these issues, but the point is that actually the easy part of our job is to get planning and build these schemes and hand them over to GPs and NHS tenants. But the hardest point is always going to be the approval in the first instance, and that's not going to change anytime soon. But although we will get clarity in the longer term, we're going to have this kind of short-term question mark where some CCGs are speeding up decision-making processes and some are slowing them down. I think that's kind of natural, dependent on where people are in the country and the changes of ICSs and STP footprints. So next slide, please. This next section talks about COVID-19 and the changes that we have kind of looked at in the last 12 months. We had, I think we've now completed 10 new build developments since COVID began, and we're on site, as I said, with 13. That means that the schemes that we've just completed were designed before COVID-19 was a word that anyone had heard about and before masks were prevalent. So what have we learned through that process? Well, we've adapted all the buildings that were on site to make sure that by the time they're opening in a different clinical environment, they're obviously fit for purpose. We're looking at one-way routes as standard through buildings, separate entrance and exits, segmenting buildings so they can be closed off for hot zones, isolation zones, out of hours work, patient staff separation being key. But also, as Ian mentioned too, the kind of dynamics of a waiting room reception interface is something that's changed massively. That's people coming in to present at the practice in person, you know, using intercoms, using the phone systems, and that increased uptake of a digital first approach is something that we're really seeing. I think for us, accessibility has to be key. So over to the next slide, please. So we did a survey. It's not just about what we're seeing, it's about what clinicians are seeing. We did a survey in August of this year, over 1,000 people for YouGov, talking about what's the impact of the estate and premises that clinicians are in at the moment, and how has COVID-19 and the pandemic impacted that. Now, before I talk about a couple of numbers here, the key one that Ian mentioned that I'd also wanted to pick up was in 2018, I think it was only 2 in 10 practices said that their premises were fit for purpose for the future in the longer term. Now, that was looking primarily at population growth, I think, Ian, at that point was the way that the question was phrased, and wasn't looking at some massive changes in service delivery and demand that we're now seeing. So on the backdrop of that, actually, I think these numbers are quite interesting. It says 1 in 5 think that their practice or their premises, and this is a wider than a primary care perspective, this is a kind of NHS trust-wide questionnaire that was done, but it says only 1 in 5 think that the premises are hindering kind of recruitment for their services, but 40% are saying that the premises are constraining the services that they're delivering to patients. And for me, a key takeaway here really is that it's not just about the buildings, it's about the clinicians that sit in them, seeing the patients. And a great clinician seeing patients is going to get the right outcomes irrespective of the building that they're sitting in. But quite clearly, if they're in a building that helps recruitment, retention, well-being, and has the right space to provide more services, then everyone benefits from that. So the dissatisfaction with premises is continuing, and that's not something that we're going to expect to change or ease anytime soon. Next slide, please. So what is Assura doing about this? Now, I've got 5 points here about the 5-point plan, how we're trying to respond and engage the NHS in a changing landscape. And the one that I really want to focus on over the next slide, please, if that's okay, is the innovation in development. I've got 4 case studies to quickly run through to show you what we're doing. So next slide, please. So 4 photos here, and on the top left is the one that Jen mentioned, the first dementia-friendly medical centre designed in the UK to that standard in Cinderford in the Forest of Dean, completed about a year ago now. I was really pleased to be working on it. We've actually looked at just not only dementia-friendly accreditation, but we're looking at a concept called cognitively supportive design, or design for everyone. We're using this as a bit of a test bed to look at an audit tool for how patients feel when they walk into premises, because in a nice way, no one really wants to see their GP at all. It's on average, what, about 6 times a year, but there's a lot of trepidation people feel when they're sat in a waiting room waiting to be seen. And so we have a unique academic research piece that's going to be linked into an audit tool that looks at dementia-friendly design principles, mixing those with autism-approved design principles, and also the kind of general issues with low mood, high anxiety, and what we're knowing increasingly as neurodiverse approaches to see how can we build calming environments so when people are there waiting to be seen by the GP, they'll get the most out of their appointment because they're not sat there in fear or overly stimulated by the environment that they're sat in. On the bottom right slide of the image here is Tunbridge, which is probably for us from a sustainability perspective, the business as usual approach that we now have. So it's got air source heat pumps, it's got a roof full of PV panels, it's an all electric scheme with no gas in it, it's got local point of use hot water systems. And that is a low carbon emission building that is actually BREEAM excellent rated, but also replies to the kind of low carbon approach, as well as having a lot of green credentials for running costs. But on the top right, you'll see Where, which is in Hertfordshire. Now, this actually is a refurbishment of an existing building, a former police and fire hub. And when you look at low carbon impact and sustainability credentials, actually brownfield development, reusing existing buildings is definitely something that we're going to be seeing more of, as I think we see policy moving towards an encouragement of not just knocking down existing buildings that could definitely be reused for alternative purposes. And in the bottom left, a scheme in Brighton, Preston Barracks. Now that's a CGI because it's halfway through being built at the moment. But again, it picks up what Jen was saying about actually primary care is moving closer to the centre of cities and the towns, and is a key part of regeneration plans that local authorities are planning. We're working with Brighton Council on that one. So that just shows you a bit of a mix of what are we seeing at the moment. Next slide, please. So what is Assura doing about that as well? Well, we're looking at the net zero carbon developments as we talked about, but look, we've got 623 existing buildings. So what are we going to do about those as well? Well, we're moving up the EPC bandings to a minimum of B on each of those, which reduces running costs for our customers and also should reduce emissions and make us more sustainable in the future too. We've looked at cognitively supportive designs, as the bottom left-hand photo shows, but importantly, we actually tried to forecast in 2018, as a caveat, or 2019, what the surgery of the future would look like in 2030. And we've done some concepts and videos and fly-throughs, and it talks about receptionless design, community diagnostic facilities, digital first approach, and a huge amount of technology. Actually, we're revisiting our 2030 surgery of the future design because fast forward 2 years and we think it's a lot closer to being reality. So there'll be a new video published later on, or early next year actually, that just shows how we're seeing that change, because I think future gazing in 2019 and for predicting what 2030 was look like, that kind of whole period is compressing. So next slide, please. So common concerns, and I'm not going to go through each of those because it can be a bit doom and gloom for GPs, but we've mentioned it, and it's one of the main reasons for the BMA premises review. Talks about last man standing, and ultimately, if you're running your own premises development, as many GPs do, and as Jen rightly says, it's one of the main options for GPs, and it also can be rewarding in the longer term. But if you're doing it as well as doing the day job, then the issues of delays, cost overruns and risks can become ever closer. We've got a team of 10 at Assura with about 200 years combined of premises experience and a lot of grey hairs, and some of that's created by stress, some of that's by age. We run the whole process for GPs, but then there is a lease that sits behind that, which means we give away as much control as possible on the buildings, but it links back into the points why the ongoing premises review is so important. So next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to talk through this slide because you'll see the word demystifying leases and probably all glaze over. Jen would probably get quite excited by this, and we have a lot of discussions throughout all our processes, but the key things quite clearly are that the rent needs to be back to back with your rent and rates reimbursement, and flexibility is key too. So signing leases to any NHS organisation, whether that's a current one or one that will exist in the future as a fully constituted health service body, so hopefully ICSs, ICBs, that's something that we try to allow standard at Assura, because respectfully, it's about looking at the NHS underwrite behind a building, which I think is the nub we're all trying to get to when we're looking at investments for the longer term. It's not the GP's individual ability to pay a rent, because actually the rent gets reimbursed. We want to look through that, enable the GP to get on with being a qualifying practice and fulfill the GMS contract, but look at the NHS underwrite beneath that. So when we're looking at new builds and the approvals that we need for that, that's absolutely key for us when we're investing. Next slide, please. So a summary. What's Assura doing in kind of 4 areas, and how are we seeing the market for premises developments? Well, it's pandemic resilience as standard as we see it. Actually, the buildings that are now on site are ones that we've had the benefit of a last minute redesign before they got to site to make sure that a lot of the pandemic resilient and pandemic proof designs, as they're now called, are being designed in on all schemes. So it has to be flexible and innovative. And really, we see 2022 as a high risk profile for us in terms of delivery. Now, that's because of build cost inflation, and that's because of the issues with delays on construction, but also because of the NHS sign-offs that we need to get those schemes up and ready and running with. And we see that the potential inertia within the system and the incoming ICBs is maybe creating some short-term lack of decision-making potentially. But I think, as we've mentioned, people go back to the good old days of PCTs, and that's something that if we can maybe move towards a closer model for, rather than having other organisations in the middle, then that would be great. And my final point from our point of view is talking about funding and the demand for funding being ever greater. That's demand from patients for NHS funding, but the good news to finish on is that the actual demand for funding outside the sector for companies like Assura and our way of accessing private capital is huge at the moment. The way to capital looking into the market and wanting to invest in primary care is massive, and that's actually proportionately good for the NHS, because every pound of rent is getting you a lot more building than it would have done on a capitalised basis than it would have done 5 or 10 years ago. So hopefully a good point to finish on. And back to you, Jen.
Thanks for that, John. So we built this seminar as finishing at 10:45, which is where we are now. If you need to drop off, then please feel free to do that. We have had some questions, and I know the panelists can stay on for another sort of 10 to 15 minutes. So if you want to stay on and listen to the answers to some of those questions, or if you have any questions that you want to raise yourself, you can still put them in the Q&A now. Then obviously you'd be very welcome to do that as well. So I am just going to have a quick look in the questions. So the one that's just come in, I think is for you, John. It says, can you give a rough estimate of the potential savings on running costs for implementing sustainable technologies in these buildings?
Good question. The way we look at it with our buildings at the moment is we're taking old GP practices, moving them into new build accommodation. So they're going to have most usually a lot more floor area, a much larger building that they're paying for. So the cost per square metre will be lower, but there may be more square metres. So we try to balance that out. Running costs for us, when we're looking at kind of a net zero carbon approach, are lower. But that's also based on the fact that electricity is increasingly cheaper and decarbonised compared to gas. So the running costs, we've got various models that we're exploring at the moment where we're seeing how far that we can reduce them, but we will reduce them as much as we can compared to the existing building. Looking at a kind of a building 10 years ago versus where it is today, the costs are lower because of the technology that we're putting in, but it's more, you can't do that like for like analysis because the energy costs per unit have gone up.
Okay, that's helpful, thank you. And then another question that's come in, what are the panel's views about the future of branch surgery premises investment? And do you think we might see more or less of this? And what will the effect of the primary care network development, what will that impact be? Ian?
No, I think it all will depend on the ICS's strategy, which is why it's important for PCNs to be involved. And I think we're going to get, 3 different levels. There's going to be the strategically important sites, which are probably going to be larger because they're going to be delivering some of the kind of wider aspects of the long-term plan. But then there's going to be probably the bulk, which are on the middle, which couldn't be used to deliver all the sort of long-term plan objectives, but are needed, are in good condition, and that may well be branch surgeries. It may be that in rural areas, your surgery might be actually strategically important because of the rurality. It'll be a different picture in urban areas as well. So a lot depends on the need, and I think that's where we're certainly going to be doing quite a lot of work on rurality. And some of the issues there. So I think sort of there's still a future for branch surgeries. They may actually look different, and actually the surgeries, that what is a main surgery now might be looked at as a branch if we have lots of hubs. But it's within the gift of the local clinicians to be involved to actually set that scene, and it'll be a gradual thing. So they're not going immediately.
Thanks, Ian. John, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I'd add to that estate strategies that PCNs have been doing, I've actually found some branch surgeries in some locations to be a really key element of flexibility when they're looking at service provision, whether that's mass vaccination rollout or hot zones and pandemic sites. And it's actually shown that sometimes practices having more than one building can mean that they look at a different service delivery model within them. Actually, from Assura's perspective, the kind of PCT to CCG changeover meant a huge amount of branch surgery development didn't happen. We're seeing that kind of creep back in now, and it is those areas of rurality where you've got quite a very sparse population that still needs to be specifically covered, rather than having people drive a lot further away, which isn't sustainable in the long term, to go to bigger premises, which reduces patient satisfaction and can increase kind of issues around admissions avoidance and the like as well. So they're here to stay as we see it. I think that messaging might be changing as we move into the ICS world because of COVID-19.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks, John. I've got a question here, which I think I might be able to answer. Our CCG has a number of leases now in the latter half of their existing term, falling into the category of re-gearing. Landlords offering an attractive deal. I'd like to see an opportunity for the ICB to take head leases of these buildings for the future. Can these existing leases be transferred they're in new buildings? Well, yes, they can. It could be that you would need landlord's consent, or it may be that it's been drafted in such a way that where it's being transferred to an NHS body, that you may be able to transfer without consent. So I'd suggest that you have a look at those leases and just see what the terms of them are. There would also be, the ICB could sit in between, even if there isn't an existing lease in between those, the current landlord and tenant. That could also happen as well. So there's a few potential there, but I would say have a look at what lease you've got now and see what you can do with that, because likely any new lease is going to be based on very similar terms, but it's certainly an opportunity now to try and introduce some of those things we've been talking about today. John, do you want to add to that?
Investors would much prefer to have an ICS entity on a lease. Tenants would. And I think that flexibility when you're regearing leases is key, that you can change terms in order to make that happen and to give that flexibility in the future, if not today. Our new build leases talk about the definition, as you'll be fully aware of, Jen, of health service body, and it needs to capture as wide a remit of the NHS as possible. So it's deliberately wide drafting, and actually you don't even need landlord's consent on a new build to do that. So if an old build doesn't have that, it's probably a modernisation point, as I see, that shouldn't be contentious for any party.
Great, thank you. And then we've got another question here. One of the key pressures on GP premises investments is a lack of long-term funding commitment by the NHS. At a local level, the impact of the rent review process as per GMS premises cost directions increases the cost to commissioners by 2 million every 3 years without any new developments or changes. NHS England do not guarantee they will increase the baseline funding to commissioners in line with this. So often it's the revenue consequences that slow premises developments. I know, Ian, you were looking to answer that one.
So I think actually sort of, this is one of the things, the lack of data we've had. And if you look at the Naylor report that sort of identified that, there is an issue with CDAL, which is the spending limits the Treasury have, which also has an impact. So effectively, we need to lobby at a national level to make sure the funding is available. We've always been shortchanged, I feel, from secondary care. And that's why I was saying about sort of, particularly as we come up to an election, I'm sure the politicians will want to be seeing cranes building hospitals, but actually, they've set out the 5-year, the long-term plan, and without investment in primary care, then actually that will fall down. So it's not a question of it being difficult. It's something which they have to do. And fortunately, as we get more data and evidence, then that becomes easier to make that case. But it is the NHS, and they get what they pay for effectively at the end of the day. So they've got to sort of choose their priorities. So that's a political decision. So we will fight on.
Thanks, Ian. John, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd echo what Ian says there. And it comes down to a point that hospital trusts are better at bidding for capital funding money compared to the regionally disparate GP practices, which are looking at it on a kind of independent contractor, potentially standalone basis. So the advent of ICSs and kind of the relationship with PCNs is going to be key going forward to try and look at that disparity changing. But it's easier to spend a lot of money in one place on a hospital than it is spending probably less money on actually getting more bang for your buck in the primary care market, looking by anyone's standards. But that doesn't necessarily happen in the same cycle as elections do, which makes it difficult to get those long-term decisions.
Yeah, agreed. I think I'd echo that as well. And then I think we've got time for one last question. In the local emergent ICS system, the impact of place as part of commissioning strategy is seen as increasingly important. So planning and funding will likely be influenced at this level. Disappointing but not surprising that 5.5 months from 1st of April, there's still a significant lack of clarity at an operational level. Any thoughts on ICB in place in respect to premises schemes? Ian, again, I think you'd flagged that you would like to answer that one.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it is really quite frightening, and I would agree, actually, fairly, true to form, that, we're less than a few months before, and actually sort of, some of the stuff we're talking about is hypothetical. We know the direction of travel, and I think that's one of the things that's sort of, actually great thing about, we're all on the same page, going in the same direction. So I think it's about that certainty, so people can plan. We can make sure that we don't lose people who have knowledge, and that strategic support, and that we get involvement. I think the issues are GPs and people who are planning are so kind of busy with all the other activity they're doing that they haven't got the headspace to think that that then the ICS will then just decide this is our plan and do on to people. But actually, we do need to have that input, and we do need that renaissance in investment in primary care. So that's why some of these documents are urgently needed to set the scene and to give that confidence. We've made that point already, and hopefully you will see some important documents published in the very near future. But yeah, it's going to be a gradual implementation anyway, so it's not going to change. And I think everybody, the different 43 ICSs will all go at different speeds. And it's about having options at the end of the day. So we will continue to push on that. Thank you.
John, do you want to add anything onto that?
I'd agree with Ian that the bandwidth of primary care to deal with these bigger decisions is narrowed with the inevitable focus on the kind of what happens week after week, and also the kind of paucity of funding when it's big numbers announced. What £250 million was announced last week, which is by anyone's reckoning £600 per practice per week. It shows you that big numbers and statements don't necessarily get transposed to any of these bigger decisions. So it's going to it's something that will be moving at different paces throughout, and we're already seeing that with the kind of speed up and slow down. And I think the point you raised, Jen, was a really good one about the place-based decision. You should also be looking at Section 106 aspect as well, and trying to kind of centralise some of those discussions, which is going to have a massive impact on funding, because we can spend Section 106 money very easily, and we've got complete flexibility to do that, and to get it from house builders. But as you said, the rules don't allow that at the moment to necessarily take place as easily as it could do.
Arguably, apparently, so someone made the case very strongly that it was, and someone made the case very strongly that it wasn't. But we'll see how that one pans out. And as I say, well, perhaps the ICBs there with more ability to look in more detail at these things than individual GPs in terms of times and resources, we might eventually get an answer to that. So. We're just coming up to 11 o'clock now, so I think we'll draw it to a close there. I'd just like to let everybody know that following leaving the meeting, you will get a feedback form. We'd be very grateful if you would fill that in. It obviously really helps us sort of plan and prepare events in the future. You'll also get sent the slides and also an edited recording of this seminar. So hopefully that will be useful to you, and obviously you can share it with colleagues, etc. But otherwise, I'd just like to finish by thanking both Ian and John for joining me today, taking the time to do that, and for all of you also for taking the time to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.